Okay. And this is really like, in my view, the concern I have more than anything, maybe with this kind of far less leftist politics, is that it doesn't leave room for private space. It doesn't leave room for the personal anywhere divorced from this sort of political superstructure. It's totalizing. Okay.
Hello, Culminators. Are you enjoying the lovely summer weather? I know that I am. Today, we're going to talk to someone that you may or may not know, but he is one of the Illuminati, it turns out, from what I read. He's a shadowy figure. He's Lomez. And he is, well, listen, why be shy about it? He's a U.S. university lecturer behind a far right Twitter account and publishing house.
Uh-huh.
And Jonathan has recently, been getting some very interesting attention. And I said, when I went to see, well, what's all this about? I said, well, okay, whoever he is, he follows me. So that means he's obviously a man of great discernment.
That's right.
And also, from what I gather, appears to be a friend of another friend of mine, who you'll notice you've never seen in the same place
That's
together.
right. That's right.
And we had Extra Dead JCB on the ColemanNation podcast a while ago. Jonathan, you are an academic, a professor, or a former professor, a lecturer. I don't know what they've done to you so far.
Yeah.
How'd you get yourself into all this?
Oh boy, where do we start? Okay, so
Start at the beginning.
first, let me say thanks for having me on. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you and your audience.
You're
I
welcome.
became familiar with you, I think, probably through your legal work. You were probably, at least, if not directly defending some people that, I've been following and supporting. You were at least vocal in your defense of them. So,
I was likely losing some very big and very courageous case for somebody.
yeah, but these are important cases to fight. And actually, I think the general topic of free speech should be sort of on our agenda here. And that's maybe where most of all, and among other things, we see eye to eye and the importance of free speech. So, okay, where do we start? I grew up in California, Northern California, and I think that's relevant because what I think a lot of the country is experiencing now was apparent in California, 10 years ago or more. California has a reputation of being sort of 10 years ahead of the curve of everywhere else, both for the good and the bad. And I think, unfortunately, most recently, this has mostly been for the bad in terms of some of the social policies and politics of the state and what it's done to middle class families, and how California in particular has approached the question of higher ed. That's my domain. So, okay, I won't get too into depth, but I had a career in tech after undergrad. I worked for Google for a little while, but was always enamored with the idea of being in academia. And I sort of had this romantic notion in particular of writing, being a writer or teaching in an English department. Being a literature professor of some kind seemed like a nice thing to do. So I went back to grad school, completed my graduate studies, and got hired to teach at UC Irvine in the English department. This was
English.
in 2012, to give some context. So, we're sort of in the middle, or the beginning, excuse me, of Obama's second term. There's this, my memory of it, I didn't really experience this too much at the time, but now looking back, we were kind of in this liminal space where socio-politically, the country was kind of figuring out where to go next after, the Bush years and the first Obama administration, which was this attempt at this kind of unity, Obama going to Iowa in the primaries, I remember, and speaking to Iraq war veterans. And he was going to be sort of the politician for everyone. Things sort of changed in 2012, fairly radically, in my view. Some people account for this, with Occupy Wall Street, for example. I have my own sort of pet theories about what was happening at the time and why from 2012 then into the middle of the 2010s, things seem to tip sort of radically to the left in terms of the prevailing ethos of our institutions, higher ed in particular. So in the English department I was teaching in, while I had, yeah, go ahead, jump in.
Stop. Snapshot. You in 2012.
Yeah.
Particularly political, not that political.
I mean,
And what
okay,
kind of
I was
what-
reading like Steve Saylor all the way back then, and I was reading bloggers like Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land, who might be described as the outer right. And I think if I had to trace my sort of ideological trajectory, I would go back to sort of Pat Buchanan. My father's like liberal, Jewish father. He was, a Bill Clintonite, and we would sit around, we would watch the McLaughlin Group. Do you remember this television
Yeah,
show on
sure.
PBS? And
Sure.
almost like just because you're an adolescent, you want to like argue with your father. I would take the side of Pat Buchanan, but truthfully, he probably spoke most closely to my sort of intuitions about sort of politics.
And he was a hell of a good debater.
He was very sharp. And on
Wrong
those
about
TV,
World War II. I will
yeah,
go to the grave believing he did a lot of harm with that book, but there were important points in that book, and they could have been packaged a little bit differently.
yes.
But he was a hero of mine. Yep.
Yeah. I love Buchanan. And of course, this then led me down, into kind of a quasi historical rabbit hole. And I became sort of enamored with Richard Nixon and the Nixon administration. And Nixon was a favorite of mine for, again, a variety of complicated reasons. But nonetheless, that sort of trajectory continued on. And I started reading, people like Paul Gottfried and Larry Oster. And I don't know how familiar you are with these guys, but
I won't. I'm nodding because that's my way of acknowledging what you're saying.
I
I don't
understand.
mind if you think I've heard the names because I have, but since you asked, I'm not very familiar with them.
Okay.
I don't have to apologize to anyone for my erudition, but it is limited.
No, it's fine. I mean, and these were relatively obscure figures. I mean, they had been kind of systematically kicked out of the mainstream conservative movement, partly because of their stance on sort of foreign wars and their disagreements with the neocons, of course. And the term paleocon is a sort of reflexive term in opposition to the neocons. So there was a
Sure.
lot of sort of animosity there. And the other big issue, and the one sort of animating my own politics, I think, was largely immigration. And again, this is why being from California is so relevant. So again,
Southern California?
I'm from Northern California, but I went to school in Southern California and lived there for
Right.
basically half my life. So kind of a child of both worlds. And they are very different sort of politically, socially, but they do share some of the same pathologies, in my view, that came out of sort of mass immigration that really was accelerated by the George Bush years. And
But
frankly,
you must have been growing up in an intellectually oriented household.
I mean, this is sort of upper middle class, suburban San Francisco. My parents, yes, they listen to NPR, they read the New York Times, we sit around
Okay,
the
no,
table.
all right, so the raw material is there because you're coming from a very similar background to mine,
Uh,
but like me, you're coming to a different political conclusion from that of your environment.
yeah,
And when I meet people like us, you're a little bit younger than I am, but when I meet people from our kind of background who become conservatives, I'm curious why we didn't follow the path that everybody else did. I mean, Jews are still overwhelmingly liberal
yeah.
in this country.
I mean, I have a variety of answers to that. I mean, I'm what some term a Mischling. Okay, I'm a half Jewish. My mother's Catholic, so I guess in some technical sense, I'm not quite considered Jewish either. But my view about that is that actually, as far as my parents are concerned, many of their intuitions that were passed down to me, and certainly the way they raised my family, were very conservative.
That's that's right, and they didn't necessarily appreciate how the world was moving away from things that they took for granted in terms of
Yes.
value.
And so Amy Wax has written about this, for example, she has this concept of sort of middle class bourgeois values, and that there are members of sort of the upper middle class, sort of liberal left, particularly from the baby boom era, where they sort of speak in these sort of rote, sort of progressive slash liberal slogans. But when you look at the actual choices they make, where they live, where they send their kids to school, how they raise their kids, the sorts of values that they inculcate in their children, they're very conservative. And they'd be hard pressed to find like a real sort of progressive, sort of liberal foundational ideology underneath it. However, the era they grew up in the 60s, the baby boomer era, it's just a very different set of cultural circumstances, political circumstances, and their politics sort of calcify at some point. This probably will happen to us too. It'll probably happen to me too. And this is something I'll have to deal with when I'm arguing with my kids at some point. Okay, fine. But they're unable to move past the kind of label and slogans that they adopted from this. And let's face it, through that period, let's call it like sort of end of the Cold War, what Francis Fukuyama calls the end of history period of the 90s, this sort of Western liberal idea prevailed. And this is where status came from. And if you were in any kind of major institution, particularly like in a place like California, you just adopted these views because all of the other high status people around you held those views. And
in fact, I've heard that just when I was in college and I took a politics course from a guy named Ken Oye.
Hmm.
He shared with us an article describing what you're describing as essentially neoconservatism.
Yeah.
Not neoconservatism is not merely the property of a bunch of old Ashkenazi men on the Upper West Side,
yeah,
or young Ashkenazi men on the Upper West Side
yeah,
who used to be liberals, but a sort of consensus, stability-oriented, Cold War liberalism.
yeah. And I think that's right. And they were trying to preserve, and if I'm being maximally charitable, I would say that they were trying to preserve the best parts of liberalism. But I think there are a variety of things that happen in the sort of intervening years from when conservatism sort of hit its high water mark to now, where that particular political project is sort of obsolete. I mean, look, take someone like David Frum, who I despise for a variety of reasons, okay? And I have massive disagreements with him. But he used to be like an immigration hawk. And sort of still is if you actually like read between the lines, but he won't say so out loud because those sort of values, the things that were animating him probably early in his career, have now been superseded by his sort of histrionics about democracy or whatever. Okay. So
the whole new republic scene of the
yeah.
80s and the
Yes.
early 90s. I
Well,
mean, that defines it.
Another guy like Mickey Kaus, okay, who is like no sort of conservative in any meaningful sense, but I actually probably agree with Mickey Kaus on,
Well, immigration remains the only thing he really cares about.
That's true. And but he's right to, I mean, not to say that's the only thing that matters, but his focus on immigration, again, this is a California centric thing. So it's no coincidence that like Mickey Kaus is a Californian.
Interesting.
And actually, I would say that if my father's no longer alive, but his politics sort of probably closely adhered to like somewhere in the Mickey Kaus sort of like range of beliefs and attitudes. Okay, now a lot of these guys I was mentioning previously, Larry Oster, the Paleocons, Steve Saylor, what drew me to their writing, and here's another example of someone who came from this broad milieu that I'm talking about, is Stephen Miller. Southern California kid, similar background, and animated by this question of immigration, because this is the thing that when you grow up in California, you're staring at sort of head on. You cannot avoid it. Now, a lot of these sort of upper middle class liberals in particular have kind of insulated themselves from the pathologies of mass immigration to their state. And their only confrontation with that reality is like the cheap gardener and cleaner who comes to their house. They essentially have these almost like indentured servants that serve them. They would never put it this way, okay? They would never like describe the relationship they have with this class of people who've been brought in to serve this sort of lower class role as this kind of tiered indentured servitude sort of relationship. But that's in effect what it is.
Sure.
And I actually, this is why I have like disagreements a lot with someone like Richard Hanania, but he's at least honest enough to sort of couch it in this way. And so I appreciate that sort of honesty. And in fact, anybody who's honest from any side, deserves some respect in a hearing. Okay, we're getting a little far afield. So anyway, this is the milieu I grew up in. This was my sort of political trajectory. Now, when it came to my teaching, when I was in the classroom and my studies, it was completely apolitical. And in fact, I went out of my way to divorce my sort of private politics from what I was doing in the university classroom. Now, what happened in this period from like 2012 to let's say like 2015, so this predates Trump really, where this change started to happen. The left for a long time, this goes back to the political correctness wars of the 90s and perhaps even earlier, had this mantra that the personal is political. And what they mean by that is that every decision we make, every behavior we take part in, our preferences as it relates to not just social preferences and like how we vote and where we live and send our kids to schools, but what kind of books we read, what kind of art and culture we participate in. All of this has a political valence. And not only does it have a political valence, that political dimension is the most important fact about those preferences and behaviors. And so the idea of being sort of apolitical in the classroom or in your art, okay, when you're writing or doing anything else, is totally anathema to this notion of the personal being political. And
it's Marxism and social realism.
of course, that's right. And that's right. The idea is a kind of totalizing politics, okay? And this is really like, in my view, the concern I have more than anything maybe with this kind of far less leftist politics is that it doesn't leave room for private space. It doesn't leave room for the personal anywhere divorced from this sort of political superstructure. It's totalizing, okay? And so my experience in teaching, I was just unable to at some point kind of make this separation. And then when the Trump election happened in 2016, I was a Trump supporter. And while I wasn't vocal about my politics, because again, my preference is to leave that to my private life, it just became untenable at some point. And I sort of limped along for a while. And my wife was also in the program with me. And eventually in 2020, COVID hits, schools shut down. Okay, we were not even like doing anything anymore. And we scattered to the winds. We left to a different state. And in 2022, they were going to call us back to campus. Now, the other complicating fact there is that they wanted us to get vaccinated in order to come back to campus. For my own reasons, I wasn't going to do that. My wife wasn't going to do that either. And so we had to make a decision about what to do next. And I decided, given my background and what was animating me at the time and still does, this sort of what I feel like there's this sort of urgent need for a new kind of literature and intellectual landscape on the right in particular, though I don't want to be too sort of, I don't want to pigeonhole what we're doing as being sort of too or overtly ideological, though there's elements of that. But given the need for this new intellectual space, as far as I was concerned, I started this publishing company. And it's called Passage Press, passage.press. And we can get into what we do at Passage, but that's the origin story. That's where I'm coming from. Happy to fill in any details.
There's an overwhelming theme both in your social media content and most recent article of yours that I read.
The Longhouse, maybe?
Yes, Longhouse. That's it.
Yeah.
And it sort of reflects that sort of panicky feeling that a lot of people feel, and people who are passionate about the life that they have grown up in and in the country that they've grown up in, and who are not necessarily intellectuals.
Yeah.
You can really discern in social media the sense of panic.
Mm-hmm.
I want to now throw something up on the screen, but I think you'll find it really intriguing. It is from a YouTuber named Speranza.
Okay.
And he's a South African expatriate. I'm gonna play 2 minutes, and I want to use it to sort of frame the rest of our discussion.
I'm talking about this massive problem that America has. You know, every single time I look at social media, turn on the TV or the news, I'm bombarded by this negative, chaotic view of America. You see riots on campus.
More than a dozen people were arrested at Ohio State University overnight.
You see homeless people, drug addicts. You see gun violence. You see urban decay. You see Disney villains prancing around as if they're attractive or something. You see, just in general, a country in decline. There's just one problem with this. And that problem is that I live in America. And I have lived here now for 5 years. And this stuff, although it exists, I just don't see it. If I walk outside now, if I go downtown now to go to a restaurant or something, I'm not going to see any of that stuff. And that's because that stuff is so amplified and so overblown, not only by people locally in America, but by adversarial powers abroad and just the international community as a whole. They will amplify every negative aspect of America to make it look as if this place is falling apart and on fire. So I wanted to talk about this because I'm not some sort of fresh off the boat tourist here. I've lived in America now for 5 years. I'm not an American fanboy either. I love America. I think it's a phenomenal country. I'll get into that in a little bit. But having lived here for 5 years, I've had to deal with all the pitfalls too. This absolutely insanely expensive medical system. I mean, my medical insurance costs me more than my rent and all of my monthly bills in China, for instance, just for my medical insurance. It's stupid. I have to deal with that. Of course, I've had to deal with the government a lot here in every aspect of getting driver's licenses and registering, you know, my daughter being born, going through the medical system and social security numbers and everything you can think of course, paying tax and dealing with that, which is very overly complicated in America for some reason. But, you know, I've had to deal with pretty much everything that's most people would complain about. And there are definitely some things to complain about in America. But before we even get into this nonsense, because I've figured it out. I understand why this phenomenon happens, and we'll get into that.
So, is he right?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a useful. I think I'm just reading from your comment there. I saw on the screen. It is a useful perspective, and I think we have to be careful about not being sort of overly hysterical and sort of just sitting here in our like bunkers waiting for a civil war to break out or something, because there is still, I think, by and large, a sort of sense that things are you know, functional or operational, that you know, neighbors aren't like even red, blue neighbors, you know, can sort of get along, or there's this sort of cold peace like across these political divides. But I would question whether or not things are trending in a good direction or a bad direction. And there's a kind of sense that in, you know, the old saying about the boiling pot, just because the frogs don't feel immediately like they're about to die or turn into soup, doesn't mean that they're not getting cooked to death. And I think if we look at our institutions and we look at and did some comparison, you know, we could pick the date we want to go back to. Let's say, again, you know, I'm biased towards this sort of period I grew up in, let's say in the 90s, although that was not perfect either, and that had its own sort of pathologies. But we can ask ourselves, are things as good as they ought to be given the level of American dynamism in terms of our economy, Or are things trending in a bad direction? You know, I'm thinking, for example, of this kind of underlying social fabric that someone like Robert Putnam, wrote about in books like Bowling Alone or Our Kids, where you look at this disintegration of social trust in communities across different classes and ethnic groups. In Our Kids, he sort of identifies that our public schools, for example, which ought to be the centerpiece of our sort of civic life, have lost their ability to effectively serve the function that they're supposed to. And as a result of these institutions, and we could scale all the way up to higher ed, but these civic institutions are basically disintegrating, and people are kind of going their own ways and forming these sort of ad hoc sort of communities of affinity groups of one kind or another. And this isn't good in the long term, in my view. And so what do we do about this sort of underlying disintegration of things like social trust, of atomization? You look at marriage rates and fertility rates and all of these different data points and the macro trends. And yeah, okay, this guy can walk out. By the way, being from South Africa, I hope America doesn't look as bad as what he's
That's right.
used to.
So good. You picked up on my second point, which was
Yeah.
that he's from South Africa or he lived there 5 years ago, but he's from the South Africa, not the South Africa for white people that existed 40 years ago, but the absolute hellscape South Africa is today. But also, and you nailed it when you mentioned public schools. People think they're walking down a beautiful street.
Yeah.
They think their children are coming home with beautiful projects from public school and singing pretty songs. They, unfortunately, yes, it is a good perspective. Don't panic. We are still America. But you have no idea what's going on in those public schools.
That's right.
You have no freaking idea. It is insane. It's insane. And not only is it, yes, I'm not experiencing violence in the street personally right now. I'm looking out the window at Manhattan. I can go to Manhattan anytime into Midtown and walk around and have a very nice New York experience. The difference is when things don't go right, not only that they don't go right, because I grew up during the riots of the 60s. You know, I've been, not during a war, but I've seen it all. The difference was in those days, authority was on the side of the majority. Authority was on the side of order and law, and now it's not. So I think his perspective is useful from a psychological and social point of view, and it's good to get it from someone who is a recent immigrant. But I think he's missing, I do think you're right. He's missing some underlying problems that do not trend well.
Yeah. So I'm not someone who thinks that like a civil war is around the corner, and you do sort of hear some of that rhetoric online. And I think there's a certain amount of people who sort of want that. Okay, they desire that sort of kinetic friction.
But what do they mean by it? It's such an aim. Obviously, it doesn't mean like a war between the states kind of situation. That's literally impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had more than one guest on this program who have asserted that there is a civil war, it's already underway, and here's what we have to. So if you mean that there's a culture war, and there's a sort of a class, fine, that is true.
Yeah.
I don't know, but you're right. Do we want to? Well, there's a struggle going on. This is what you're writing about. This is what you're observing.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to discount the possibility of that happening either. So while it's not at our doorstep right now, it certainly could be. I mean, I'm thinking of it's kind of an outrageous book, but the military historian, scholar, William Lind. Are you familiar with William Lind? He coined the term fourth generation warfare.
Oh.
He wrote a novel called Victory, which was about a kind of civil war unfolding according to the sort of fourth generation warfare principles that he wrote about elsewhere. It's in lurid detail, where you almost get the sense that he was sort of like enjoying himself a little too much as he's sort of like writing about a kind of army of like Jeffersonian agrarian, farmers, like American kulaks, essentially, like rising up to take on the Bolsheviks, okay, like in the universities and stuff. And while I doubt that this kind of kinetic warfare or spontaneous coordination between these factions is even possible in our current circumstances, maybe precisely because of a lot of the lack of social trust and sort of atomization that we see, it does sort of, reading that sort of thing does remind you, like, look, these things are possible. They do happen. And like, we don't have to go so far back in history to see a time when an otherwise sort of stable nation started cracking apart, and it was, slow, but then happens all at once. And I think we have to be mindful of the possibility for something like that happening. I don't personally see where that could start, and I don't want it to happen. I mean, I have 3 young kids. I'm not hungry for a hot war. That would be sort of a horrific possibility. There are better ways to solve our underlying problems. However, it may be possible, but also, okay, the last thing I want to say on this, we can move on to the next point, though, is that what this guy is identifying, this kind of like comfortable stasis that he sees, and that the trouble and the sort of cultural flashpoints are merely a kind of illusion or spectacle of online digital life, just simply isn't true. I mean, I remember, going back to 2020, the George Floyd riots. It so happened that this is a personal thing, but the restaurant where my wife and I had our rehearsal dinner, for example, got burned down in one of these riots, okay, in one of these cities. As an example, we saw what was real violence, and that was certainly, that had the possibility to escalate into something much more severe. And to discount that something like that couldn't happen again, and happen rather quickly, is, I think, very naive.
But we also had a totalitarian experience between then and now. The COVID years were a bona fide totalitarian experience where it didn't have that kinetic aspect, or to a large extent, it did not have the coercive aspect in the military sense, but the coercive aspect was right there. It was right there, and it was not a test that we passed with flying colors.
No,
and it also resulted in a further deterioration of the trust society. And of the bonds. So, believe it or not, we've been talking for over half an hour. In your overall worldview, what do you think is going to work? If you're not obviously abandoning it. When Pat Buchanan was writing, there was something to grab onto. Although even then, I think he was fooling himself about what other Catholics thought about social issues. He was already, I think, they were already past him, moving left as a group. 40 years later, you're a product of intermarriage. People don't make life commitments outside of, you used a very important term before, which I've promptly forgotten. Atomized, like I live in a subculture of Orthodox Jews. And for us, it's going great guns. We're very cognizant of what's going on around us. And as is typically the case with subcultures, it reinforces our belief that we're doing it right. Look how badly they're doing it. But it's not good for anyone involved for it to go to hell, especially not us. Especially not us. And evangelicals, I don't know. To me, the obvious leap is always to faith, but that might not work in the 21st century.
Well, I think it's a necessary but insufficient condition. Okay, I do think
That's scary.
yeah, but well, maybe not. I mean, you know, there really isn't a kind of like robust secular answer to faith communities. What you see instead are these sort of nominally secular affinity groups substitute traditional religion with, you know, like wokeism, these sort of quasi religions of one kind or another. And so it's going to be religion no matter what. It's just what
Okay.
is the nature of of these religious beliefs, because they are, even those sort of liberal or progressive religions, or what they would call ideologies, are grounded in a faith of a kind. I mean,
Yes.
they don't
Oh, for
have
sure.
any better access to first principles than anyone else. They might fool themselves, delude themselves into thinking they do, but you know, I much prefer the honesty of a group of people who just commits themselves to a god, and so that's where it's coming from. I mean, it's look, my own religious beliefs aside, it's just it's more likely to be true, and it's a better answer from a strictly sort of utilitarian or functional perspective, in my view. Okay, so that's one thing. I also look, if you're asking me for like answers about how to get through this and sort of break through, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer. And because I don't have an answer, and sort of almost distrust anybody who is so committed to one answer that, you know, they are excluding other possibilities, this is why, you know, free speech and this sort of new intellectual environment is so important to me. We need to throw a lot of stuff at the wall and see what sticks, and we don't know ahead of time what is going to be the most effective sort of ideological or cultural tools to get us through this impasse. And it's a mistake also, I should say, you know, and reactionaries of various kinds, I think, fall into the trap of thinking, okay, well, we can just return to something that came before us. And, you know, George Bush, one of the few things he said that was very wise was, I think we can all agree the past is over. And I think there's something,
Almost a Yogi Berraism.
yeah, that's right. But, you know, there's something profound about that. We have to go forward. We have to push through. And even if, okay, so one sort of topic of mine that I think is important that a lot of people have begun to sort of, it's become actually mainstream in a sense. And I give credit to people like Christopher Caldwell and Chris Rufo, Richard Hanania, for example, say, okay, let's revisit civil rights law. And let's really think about like the functional effects of certain aspects of civil rights law, like disparate impact, for example. And let's really sort of take a hard look at whether or not these are solving the problems that they were intended to solve, or creating new problems, or whatever the case may
And that
be.
process is underway. Disparate impact
Yes,
is hanging by a slim thread.
which and I would love to see disparate impact go the way of affirmative action. Okay, this is, I think, very important. Although even with affirmative action, you know, there's a concept called manipulating procedural outcomes. Like even if you sort of de jure outlaw these things, there are ways of sort of manipulating policies and regulations and how certain sort of policies are put into effect to achieve de facto the same outcomes that the laws and that the previous law, the status quo ante, was intended to achieve. So I want to be careful about focusing too much on law. But now back to the general point is, even if we can undo, let's say, disparate impact or these major pillars of civil rights law, it's not going to be a return to pre-civil rights law. We're going to now be in a future in which there was a thing called civil rights law and had this, you know, half a century history in which it was in effect and changed the sort of fabric of our institutions and bureaucracies. And now after that, we're going to have to confront this new context and operate within this new context in which that past existed. So there just is no going back. It has to be a forward-looking vision. And this is why, so some of the people we publish, for example, Nick Land, he's sort of coined this term neo-reaction, which is this kind of highly theoretical sort of concept of sort of right-wing politics that has certain complicated answers to some of these questions, or Curtis Yarvin, who is a self-identifying monarchist, you know. Okay,
Oh, I should meet him.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he's a very interesting guy. You guys would have a great conversation, I'm sure. Um, Now, whether or not you agree with any of these particular prescriptions that these guys are making, and I, for now, will just sort of remain agnostic on that question, it's important for us to consider these things. Okay, it's important for us to sort of be thinking outside the box. I think we have to approach this as a kind of intellectual, sort of ideological Manhattan Project. There's no sort of potential or possibility for solution that should be discounted on its face. We have to find like smart, thoughtful people. And if they're pushing in a particular direction, let's follow them and see where that goes. And if there are good practical reasons why we shouldn't pursue that any further, then we retreat and go on to the next path. And it's like finding your way through a maze. And I think people are afraid of this. Okay, people are afraid of ideas. They're afraid of new things. They're afraid of ideas that are outside the box. They want to sort of stay constrained within this comfortable Overton window that they've grown accustomed to. And I guess if anything else, my project is to just come in and sort of blow that whole thing up and say, no, okay, this isn't going to be the way we find a solution. We have to be more creative. We have to be more sort of intellectually radical in some sense to combat the kind of intellectual radicalism of the left. And that doesn't mean falling into the same sort of pathologies and traps that they fall into, but we have to be open to new ideas. And I want to really put that on the table for those of us on the right.
And that and part of that learning process is, you know, and a lot of the groypers, people who, you know, who follow many of our friends,
Yeah,
and us,
yeah,
this bullshit penny, you know, dime store racism.
yeah,
Yeah, I get it. You have to be a lot more realistic about racial policy and racial politics and all the things.
yeah,
But we're here now. We're here now. We're not going back to whatever it
yeah,
is you think was before that was better.
yeah.
You familiar at all with Michael Burley,
I'm
Sacred
not,
Causes?
no. Mm-mm.
So that he writes he is a great, phenomenal historian. Not, I would not call him a conservative, but I would call him someone who has historically been very critical of a lot of the trends that we're talking about. Never mind that 3.63, it's wrong. The structure that you've chosen to tackle this is not to start a think tank or a university, but to publish books, get them out there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I would consider other avenues for doing this. And we have sort of discussed the possibility of a sort of 501c3 arm of this organization where we can do certain things where we're not sort of tethered to making a profit. And certainly that would be useful. And I have what you're putting up on the screen now is a art contest, because I think actually that non-explicit ideological art, you know, storytelling really is the basis for whatever comes next. We have to be able to tell ourselves sort of stories that model what a sort of productive and flourishing life looks like, not only in our present environment, but in whatever environment comes next. So I think that's a really important component to this. I do want to just briefly go back though to this question of like what you called sort of dime store racism and
Oh,
you
yeah.
know this kind of like vulgar sort of reactionary politics of various kinds. Again, like as a more or less free speech maximalist on these questions anyway, I think we have to sort of entertain, if not the specific arguments they're making, which are pretty very often, not all the time, but are often easily identifiable as being just sort of wrong on their face. Okay, like we should sort of push back against those claims and identify why they're wrong and show the right answer to those questions. But you know, by the way, some of these people might be making critiques that are important for us to listen to and are important for us to reflect on and at least ask, okay, why are these certain set of critiques, whether they're aimed at, Jews or various, like Jews ought not to be exempt from these kinds of critiques. And I don't
Yes.
want to say, okay, well, it's just this sort of like vulgar anti-Semitism, therefore ignore it. No, let's look
They're
at
right.
this.
No, they're 100%. There's something, and there is something. There's a reason that there's an audience for that now, and it's not because the Jews have been thrown out of 125 countries.
No.
It's it's because we have to make a reckoning. All Americans have to make a reckoning of what contributes to our culture and who creates that culture and what are the ideological and social forces that make it what it is.
Yeah, and I mean, I, look, it's a complicated question, but it's perfectly reasonable for a certain segment of Americans to look at our foreign policy over the last 2 decades, okay, and say and ask themselves and look at, for example, the previous group, like look at the neocons and their position on foreign policy and whatever else, and to say, is it the case that our foreign policy is in some sense being subordinated by a preference toward Israel, and that is somehow having a negative effect on our foreign policy more broadly? I'm not asking you to answer that question. We don't need to get into the weeds, but it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask.
Absolutely.
And just because people are asking that question, we can't just dismiss them and say, oh, this is some kind of vulgar anti-Semitism. How dare you notice that the neocons were Jewish? Okay, they were. So let's reckon with that fact. It's
Right.
okay to reckon with that fact.
100%.
And frankly, when it comes to questions like anti-Semitism in the US, it's my view that organizations like the ADL, for example, have verified many of the complaints that people make about Jews sort of focusing exclusively on anti-Semitic rhetoric and using the power that they have in media, for example, to silence or suppress views that are critical of Jews. And I think they're doing themselves a disservice. Now, I think there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the ADL on the one hand and sort of this vulgar anti-Semitism on the other hand. They give each other a purpose, okay?
That's
Like
right.
they're their own raison d'etre. So it's hard to sort of disentangle the incentives there. But anyway, I just want to say that all of these questions are perfectly legitimate. We have to be confident enough in our public discourse and our ability to sort of make arguments and make the case to accommodate these sorts of views. And I think back on this is something my father used to celebrate as kind of the high watermark of America and Americanism, whatever that meant in the late 20th century. And it was the ACLU, of course, defending the Nazis in Skokie, Illinois. Okay.
Right. That's
This
always
this is
the
like, not only was it sort of the right thing to do and sort of serve the purpose of the ACLU, but it also demonstrated this self-confidence in who we were. Okay. We could do this. We had the sort of strength and this resilience and belief in our own values to make a stand like that. And I think one thing we've lost is that sort of self-confidence. I think all of us sort of feel like these beliefs that we hold dear, whether it's free speech, and you see this like in concerns over misinformation and disinformation. We got to make sure that these people can't have these ideas, or this article about me and my publishing company. This is derived from a lack of confidence in who we are. There is a crisis of our belief in what it means to be American. And one of the ways this is expressed is through this kind of totalitarian sort of speech norms, these censorship norms. And so anyway, I don't have, again, a great answer for how we combat this, but it's a serious problem. And it simply just can't be the case that we ignore anybody who makes critiques of us or Jews or blacks or pick your group. Everybody's open. Let's all put our cards on the table and make the case. Okay. That's my
One of the
view.
most fun things about social media, in fact, is that you can make friends with woke black people and woke Orthodox Jewish people and woke atheists and woke Catholics, and in a way that you might not in meet space. And these are the people who are the most comfortable talking about the problems within their groups. Because when I say woke, I mean based.
I see. Okay.
I mean
Yeah.
our woke. It's because in a way that the risk-free aspect of social media that is so corrosive in many respects also enables interaction that you otherwise would never have.
Yeah.
Do you have any concerns, though, that at the end of the day, what your prescription of, let's have ideas, let's have free expression, is really just another version of the liberalism that has gotten us here? In other words, it's this sort of counter argument that there are some forces that are so corrosive and so antithetical to these values that perhaps, and this is a discussion I've had with Michael Knowles a couple of times, because I kind of ask him, well, let's say we do draw the line and say, well, what would the founding fathers have thought? And therefore, we're not going to admit into the pantheon of civil religion devil worship. Okay, I get like that. Standing by itself, that sounds fine, but as a practical matter, how does that work in a pluralistic society? I don't see how it can.
I mean, you're the lawyer, you're the legal scholar. I'm not going to pretend as if free speech law in particular isn't a complicated mess, and that upholding sort of principles of free speech, doesn't come with certain costs and certain drawbacks and a requirement for a certain kind of tolerance of ideas that, yes, may be so corrosive that they could overturn the sort of very tolerance that allows them to exist in the first place. The paradox of tolerance. Okay. And I've made this joke before: when the right wins, I'm perfectly aware that they're going to sort of put me against the wall for my, commitment to free speech. I think I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. That's the particular role that I serve. But I think we really do. I also think it's a bit of naivety or a kind of like sophistry to assume that we can't make meaningful practical decisions about where and how to apply these principles. And so a state or public sponsored like drag queen show for kids, does that rise to the same levels of protection for political speech as a book by Ernst Jünger or something?
Well, going to your point about, again, here we're not where we were in 1965. We're in 2024. That might very well mean that we can acknowledge that the Berger court, to talk about speech, or the Warren court in particular, the Warren court made some bad calls. They made some bad calls. They read the First Amendment free speech guarantee as guaranteeing things that were really never contemplated and that have resulted in real societal cost.
Yes.
And we don't have to throw out the First Amendment and the concept of free speech to say, let's make better decisions. It's sort of like the Supreme Court did with affirmative action. Institutionally, we're wrong.
Yeah. And, I'm not sure like where I would say the court has been wrong in the past about this or that decision over free speech. And we could probably sit here for hours and like go through the nuances of that. And it's actually very interesting and sort of very important. And I think in terms of establishing precedent, and not just where speech is allowed, but what constitutes speech? I mean, when we're talking about speech, what does that even mean? And what are the boundaries of like a speech act that we want to protect under this thing called the First Amendment versus these other kinds of, you know, behaviors and expressions that we could sort of exclude from this, you know, more focused category of acts that we call speech. And like, again, I don't quite have the answer to that. On balance, though, I'm always going to err on the side of more rather than less. Not only because it's politically good, not only for these like sort of utilitarian arguments, you know, like you go back to John Stuart Mill or whoever, and you say like, okay, because we want truth to win out, and the only way for truth to win out is by these sort of competing ideas, and we have to let people sort of try out all sorts of bad ideas in order to get to the good ideas. I believe that's true, but that isn't the only reason. I think free speech, as I understand it, as I sort of grew up with it, is good for the soul. Okay, it's good in its own right. In and of itself, it is good. And for us to have, and I'm saying this sort of selfishly, you know, I'm a sort of bookish, intellectually curious person, and as someone who's a writer or operates sort of in the life of the mind, I just think we need to allow ourselves the freedom to think about and express all sorts of different ideas, test out that expression against other competing ideas, and go from there. And where it becomes untenable, sure, I suppose there's some negotiation. But, you know, if we look around, like I look at this kind of disinformation regime that we're seeing sprout up. You see all these programs, like at Harvard has one, and, you know, all these schools now, Stanford, they all have these like disinformation, misinformation programs, which are really just designed to like silence people on the right. Okay. It's hard to really see much daylight between what they're doing and calling disinformation and just right-wing opinion. Okay.
Right.
And so that's scary to me. Okay. That's the kind of thing that sort
It's
of keeps
scary,
me up at night.
but on the other hand, it tells you we are a threat to them.
Totally. I think they're only doing it precisely because there's a crisis on their side. They know they can't win on the merits. They've sort of run out of arguments. And the response then is to silence whatever we're saying. And so I understand why they're doing it, but I don't want to live within a sort of constitutional legal regime, a sort of legal structure that would allow them to sort of implement the maximal version of this sort of disinformation regime and go to social media companies and sort of make demands that, for example, you can't challenge the efficacy of the vaccination, okay, or whatever. Pick your topic of choice, or for that matter, challenge the idea that the earth is round. Okay. I want flat earthers to be able to go online and like make their argument for why the earth is flat, for why 9/11 was an inside job.
And the same thing with Holocaust denial.
Yes, absolutely. 100%. Okay. Make the argument. Fine. Okay. We're not going to like the idea that some catastrophe is going to befall us by allowing these ideas to sort of percolate and proliferate, I think is incredibly sort of hysterical. There's just no evidence to back up that that's the case. And by the way, the truth is that we actually may learn something from these people. Okay. Believe it or not, we might. I was having this discussion with Razib Khan, and we were talking about creationists, and the fact that actually creationists, the smartest ones, have helped biologists sort of understand better, like biogenesis, like where did life come from? It's because they're asking really difficult questions. Like they get to the ground core of like, what is the argument being made on the side of official truth? And yeah, the Holocaust is a very complicated, it's very well documented, but it's a complicated question. Okay. Like we should be able to have this conversation and tolerate people who even claim that there was no such thing. There was no like program to murder Jews. Okay. So what if someone says that? It's okay.
That's right. And you know, it also, that goes to matters of faith in and of themselves. Do you know what do you know what the Muslims believe? Do you know what the Jews believe?
Right.
Yeah, they're Muslims.
Yeah.
That's their religion.
Yeah.
If you don't prescribe to that religion, the Jews think they're God's chosen people. So you're Jewish, and now you feel bad about it? I'm not Jewish. So what the hell do you care what the Jews believe?
Yeah.
What's it? Why is it a problem for you? We could go on. It's been an hour. So I think you and I have a lot to talk about. I hope we get a chance to do it again.
Yeah.
Oh, there's one more question, though. You've probably been asked it many times. How do you get from Jonathan Keeperman to L0m3z?
Okay, L0m3z is a character from Seinfeld, and he's one of Kramer's off-screen friends, and you never see him. And he's a very interesting, weird character who has a lot of idiosyncratic sort of hobbies and whatnot. So, you know, being anonymous, like not being on screen, I thought was
Okay,
like
no,
a
I get
nice.
it. In other words, he fulfills certain script needs
Yes,
that were something even weirder than Kramer himself
that's right.
has to be accountable for some. Okay, so
Yes.
shame
He
on me
happens
for
to be
not knowing.
Orthodox Jew, actually. L0m3z.
Oh, is
Yes.
it low?
That's part
Of
of
course.
the
What a typical
broad
name for an Orthodox.
Seinfeld lore. Yeah. So,
Jonathan, great talking to you. Thanks a lot for coming.
likewise.
We'll
Thanks,
keep you
Ron. I
posted.
appreciate it. Okay,
Okay,
take
have a
care.
great day.